I heard this story recently that really made me realize I needed to change the way I looked at the dreams that God has given me to pursue. You may have heard it too, burn the ships, but I'm going to share it with you because I really think that the principle it kind of teaches is something that each of us believers really need to hear. And the story goes back to the early 1500s when a Spanish conquistador named Hernan Cortez arrived on the shores of what is now known as Mexico with his men, right? They had crossed an ocean to get there. Behind them were ships that represented safety, familiarity, and the possibility of retreat. You see, if things went badly, those ships gave them a way out. They could turn back, return home, and abandon the mission they set out for. But Cortez made a decision that would define the entire expedition. Once they landed, he ordered them to burn the ships. That meant there could be no return, no retreat, and no backup plan. The men had no option but to move forward and face the unknown and commit fully to what they had set out to do. Are you seeing a correlation here? Whether you agree with the historical context or not, the principle behind that has endured through centuries, right? When there is no way back, your focus kind of changes. Your resolve deepens. Your commitment to your mission becomes real in a way it could never be when escape was still an option. As extreme as that story sounds, it really mirrors something that many of us wrestle with internally, especially when it comes to trusting God with our desires that He's placed in our hearts. For single Christian women like myself, in particular, this tension shows up in a very real, very personal way, right? Many of us have probably heard more times than we can count that we're expecting too much, that our standards in dating are unrealistic, that we should just give someone a chance even when there's no real attraction, no genuine interest, no excitement about building a life together. We're told that wanting more must mean that we're prideful or picky or ungrateful rather than faithful. And over time, those messages can wear us down, right? Even if you believe God has something good for you, a quiet fear can begin to form underneath the surface. A fear that maybe God won't actually come through. A fear that if you hope too much, you'll only end up disappointed. And so, almost without realizing it, you begin to form backup plans. Not always out loud, but in your heart, right? You tell yourself that if the right person doesn't come along, you'll just settle for something less than what you hoped for. Or if that calling feels too difficult, too uncertain, or too slow to unfold, you'll eventually just retreat into what feels safer and predictable. These plans feel responsible, they feel practical, they even feel wise, but they're rooted in more of a self-protection rather than trust. One of the clearest biblical pictures that we see of this divided posture shows up in the story of Lot's wife. Do you remember her? I think God even says, remember Lot's wife in the New Testament, right? When God rescued Lot and his family from Sodom, they were given a clear instruction not to look back. That command wasn't about geography. It was about allegiance. Looking back revealed that her heart was still attached to what God was calling her out of. Physically, she was leaving, but emotionally and spiritually, she had not fully let go. And I think that's where many of us we find ourselves in that. We follow God forward in theory, but we keep a mental and emotional escape route just in case things don't go the way we hoped. We obey, but we do it cautiously. We trust, but only partially. We move forward, but with one eye still fixed on what we might return to if this doesn't work out. And that divided posture affects everything. Now, before I go any further, I want to be very clear on what this message is not. Burning the ships does not mean being reckless or irresponsible. It doesn't mean forcing relationships, manipulating outcomes, ignoring wisdom, rushing God's timing. No, none of those things. It doesn't mean pretending that fear doesn't exist or refusing to ask hard questions. Wisdom, counsel, and discernment still matter. What burning the ships does means deciding at a heart level that obedience is not something you negotiate when things get uncomfortable. It means choosing not to retreat simply because the path God has for you feels more difficult than you expected. I was reminded of this very personally, during the process of buying my house. From the outside, it looked like a straightforward testimony of provision. And it was a testimony of provision, but living through it felt anything but simple. I mean, there was a process of delays, negotiation, unexpected obstacles all along the way. The closing date kept getting pushed back again and again, and each delay brought more uncertainty. There came a point where I genuinely wondered whether I had misunderstood God. I wasn't frustrated because it was taking longer than I wanted. I was unsettled because the resistance felt constant. I began asking myself whether all of these obstacles were a sign that maybe I should turn back and choose something safer, because renting another apartment was a very real option, and in many ways, it would have been the more comfortable choice. But deep down, I knew that choosing the easier route in that moment wouldn't have necessarily been an act of wisdom. It would have been an act of fear. So I stayed the course, even while questioning and praying, and even while not having all of the answers. And in the end, I closed on my house 1 week before I needed to move out of my apartment. God's timing, right? And looking back now, I see that that difficulty wasn't evidence that I missed God, but more of an invitation to trust Him more deeply than I had before. The struggle didn't mean that I was on the wrong path. It just meant that I was maybe being a little stretched, right? I think this is where many people really get stuck. We assume that if something is truly God's will, it'll just unfold so smoothly and prettily, is that a word? Without resistance, right? But scripture and life experience tell a very different story. Often the things that God calls us to require persistence precisely because they are significant. They require endurance because they matter. This is especially true when it comes to relationships, calling, and purpose. The temptation to settle rarely shows up as a dramatic decision, right? It usually shows up quietly in the form of lowered expectations, compromised boundaries, or abandoned dreams altogether. And it sounds reasonable and mature, but over time, it slowly erodes your faith. When you hold on to a backup plan, it subtly changes how you engage with God. You stop expecting Him to move. You stop praying with boldness. You stop believing that His promises apply to your specific life and circumstances. And faith becomes more of a theoretical instead of actually being lived. Burning the ships is about making an internal decision that there is no going back to a smaller version of obedience just because trusting God feels vulnerable. It's about choosing to believe that God's plans are not only good in theory, but trustworthy in practice. For us single women, this means refusing to believe that God's best requires you to abandon your God-given desires. It means trusting that alignment, attraction, and spiritual depth are not luxuries, but they are a part of the abundant life that God promises. It means waiting with faith rather than settling out of fear. And yes, the waiting can be uncomfortable. I know full well. It can raise questions and it can test your patience and your confidence. But disappointment is not the enemy. Disobedience is. Disappointment can be healed, but compromise shapes the direction of your life. And the same principle applies to your calling and career. When God places a vision in your heart, it rarely unfolds without resistance, right? There will be moments when returning to what feels familiar, it seems appealing, but burning the ships doesn't remove the fear. It does remove the option of retreating simply because obedience is costly. So if you're feeling discouraged right now, if you're feeling tempted to quit or settle or scale back what you once believed God for, burn the ships. Because when you finally decide that there's no way back, something shifts inside of you. Your faith truly becomes activated. Your prayers become bolder. Your trust in God's character deepens in ways it could never when retreat is still on the table. Now, you don't burn the ships because you're fearless. You burn them because you trust the one who called you forward. And that kind of trust is never wasted. And you know what? Burning the backup plan is only the beginning. Staying the course is going to require endurance, faithfulness, and daily trust. That's why I encourage you to watch my next video on persistence as well, because faith is not proven in a single decision, but in continued obedience over time. I hope this blessed you today, and until next time, have a blessed week.